Everybody wants to know, how much Bitcoin do you need to retire? Well, I've been in Bitcoin for 9 years and I've always been bullish. I've told you guys, I think you can retire with as little as zero point 0.1 Bitcoin. But I found some new data this week that I'm super excited to share with you that has made me even more bullish. I want to show you some of the new data and the simulations I found that I think has just gotten me even more bullish when we understand just how rare it is to own a certain amount of Bitcoin. I've been going back and forwards with ChatGPT all morning. I've been asking it all sorts of different questions and telling it, hey, how quickly is this Bitcoin future going to, unfold? How much Bitcoin do I need? And all of this is changing because what the hedge funds and the bankers have been recently saying about Bitcoin. Today, there's a $40 billion hedge fund that just came out and said this. Calamos came out and said, look, I think everybody needs a 10% Bitcoin allocation. And then, of course, we're familiar with other big banks and, well, the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, talking about a 2% Bitcoin allocation. And then last week, something else kind of caught my attention. Spain's second largest bank came out and said, look, a 7% Bitcoin allocation is what we recommend you do. And again, they only shared this with their wealthy clients. So today I've kind of put all of this data together and I've got prepared for you guys what I think is an incredibly bullish show. So let's start first breaking down what's changing in the world of the biggest banks around the world and the biggest hedge funds around the world, because they all of a sudden just seem to be changing and changing and changing their advice for their clients on Bitcoin. So let's have a look at Spain's second largest bank. Now, I have been informed that this is the global bank. These guys are all over the world, but they're only telling their very wealthy clients, hey, maybe a 7% Bitcoin allocation is where we should start. Now, again, 7% in and of itself doesn't sound like a huge number, right? But what happens when the banks and the world's largest asset managers, who control hundreds of trillions of dollars, all start settling on this, 5 to 10% Bitcoin allocation for people's portfolios? Because we do know that there's only 2.1 million Bitcoin on exchanges today. If these guys control hundreds of trillions of dollars and they start telling their clients you need 5% Bitcoin, all of a sudden, when that toothpaste comes out of the tube, she's not going back in. And if you've got 10, 20, or $30 trillion wanting to come into Bitcoin, and there's only 2 to 3 to 4, maybe 5 million Bitcoin actually circulating and available for sale, the numbers are going to get really weird. And this obviously changes how much Bitcoin I think you're going to need to retire. So let's start breaking this down. What did BBVA say? Well, they came out and said 7% Bitcoin allocation. And this is interesting. We can see here, this percentage allocation closely aligns with one of the prominent industry leaders. For context, Thomas Petterfly, the 46th wealthiest man in the world, he recommends a 2 to 3% exposure to Bitcoin. And BlackRock's Larry Fink suggests a 2 to 5% portfolio allocation to Bitcoin. So you can see how these allocations are slowly starting to move their way up. BlackRock started at 2, now Larry Fink's talking about 2 to 5. We've also got another multi-trillion-dollar asset manager, Schwab. They're having people on their very sophisticated and exclusive internet. What do they call it? It's an interview series that they hold on Schwab Network. They're talking about 10% Bitcoin allocations. We played you that video last week. We've now got a $40 billion hedge fund, Calamos, talking about 10%. So if we start crunching some numbers, this is where things are going to get really bullish. And this is where you're going to see that we don't really need that much money to flow into Bitcoin to start pushing it to some really absurd levels. Okay, this is where things get really interesting, especially when we start talking about the brand new report that I covered for you guys last week, looking at the Bitcoin multiplier effect. Okay, we have a new report that came out last week that I think is absolutely fascinating. Again, to re-jog your memory, this new report was done by Gemini. As you can see, this puppy's about 10 pages. They did a ton of research. They looked at just how much Bitcoin is actually available for sale. They looked at how Bitcoin is being accumulated by governments, billionaires, sovereign wealth funds. Here, one of the first lines I found interesting from this report, over 30% of Bitcoin's circulating supply is now held by just 216 centralized entities. So they're saying that the supply suffocation is now changing the dynamics when it comes to Bitcoin's multiplier effect. I found this report really interesting. I'm going to give you guys the TLDR. At the bottom of the report, they gave us two different multiplier effects. This here, as you can see, is the short-term Bitcoin multiplier effect. So in the short term, we can see for short-term impacts, the 30-day market cap multiplier can range from near 0 to 25x. But on average, the short-term multiplier is 8x. So this means if $1 of capital wants to come in, this will briefly move the market by around $8. Okay, so we now have more conclusive data. This is all on-chain data as well. This isn't speculative. This isn't theoretical. This is based on real data showing us that we have an 8x Bitcoin multiple. This is interesting because when we jump on over here, we start thinking about how much money the banks and the hedge funds own. This is where the maths gets a little bit wonky. And this is, again, going to show you why I've kind of changed my mind a little bit about my recommendations and telling people how much Bitcoin I think they need. When you look at all the money in the world, the global hedge funds, they hold something like $5 trillion. Banks hold tens of trillions of dollars. And the asset managers around the world like BlackRock and Charles Schwab and Vanguard, they hold over $50 trillion of capital. So if you say they hold about, 100 to $200 trillion, well, let's go back to what's changed. These guys who hold $200 trillion of capital, the consensus opinion now seems to be that a 5 to 10% Bitcoin allocation is now the norm. This is normal. So let's assume all of the bankers, the world's largest asset managers, and these hedge fund guys want to put 10% of their portfolio and their capital under management into Bitcoin. So we've got 200 trillion. Again, this is just rough numbers. This is a live stream. Run your own numbers at home. This isn't an exact science. Again, I encourage you to do your own numbers. But $200 trillion, 10% of that, that would represent $20 trillion of demand wanting to flow into Bitcoin. This is where everyone goes wrong. People think, okay, $20 trillion of demand flowing into Bitcoin. I know that gold's a $21 trillion market cap asset right now. So Bitcoin would be worth about $1 million, just more than gold, right? Wrong, because we're forgetting that multiplier effect. Today it's 8x. So we have to go $20 trillion of hypothetical demand times by 8. All of a sudden we've got a market cap of $160 trillion for Bitcoin. So 21 million coins, that would represent a Bitcoin price tag somewhere around $8 million a coin. Let me do the quick maths for you guys. I know I get called out for my maths here on these live streams. I apologize. So let's say we've got 160. Let's see if someone can beat me to it in the comment section. We got 160. Good luck if you're going to beat me. 160 divided by 21. Okay, so we got a $7.6 million price tag per Bitcoin if 10% of the money managed by the banks, the hedge funds, and the asset managers want to flow into Bitcoin, because this is the consensus right now. So all of a sudden, this opens up the next question. How much Bitcoin do you need to retire? This is, again, the age-old question in Bitcoin. Everybody wants to know, how much do you need? Well, found some interesting charts I want to run through. Again, some people think you need like 10 Bitcoin to retire. I always ask them the question, do you really think you need 10 Bitcoin to retire? I don't think so. And I'm going to break out the calculator to also prove why you need much less than 10 Bitcoin to retire. But let's have a look at some of these distribution charts that I think are really informative in the Bitcoin space. So a no coiner, it's a fish with no flesh. A shrimp, entities who hold less than 1 Bitcoin. Now let's have a look at how many shrimps there are on the Bitcoin network. So I was talking to ChatGPT earlier, and I asked it to make me some charts. And I did find that 50 million addresses hold between 1 Satoshi and 1 million Satoshis. So that is 1% of a Bitcoin, 0.01 Bitcoin. So as you can see here, again, ChatGPT is not the best. So you have to kind of convince it, so to say. You need to kind of tell it, hey, can you make this a little bit better? I'll buy you a nice steak dinner and get you a big old glass of red wine. And then if you prompt ChatGPT, you can get some good data out of it. So I've tried my best to get some good data out of ChatGPT. It told me that there's about 288 million addresses that would be called a no coiner. So these are entities who hold less than 1 Bitcoin. And then things get more interesting because it told me there's around tens of millions of people who would be considered a shrimp. There's a couple of million people who would be considered a crab. Let's jump on over here and take a little bit of a peep at what is a crab. So we can see a crab is someone who holds between 1 to 10 Bitcoin. An octopus is someone who holds between 10 and 50 Bitcoin. A fish, 50 to 100. And as you can see, the numbers get a little bit wonky when we start talking about the big boys and the whales. But again, I don't think we need to be holding hundreds of Bitcoin or even tens of Bitcoin to retire when we start really thinking about things bigger picture here. Because Bitcoin is just simply a lot more scarce than most people, and even most Bitcoiners, realize. Right now, we're living through this environment where coins on exchanges are rapidly disappearing. There's less and less Bitcoin nearly every day available for sale. There's only it depends upon what data set you're looking at. Yes, there's somewhere around 2 to 2.5 million Bitcoin on exchanges. And doesn't matter what data set you look at, that number is shrinking. And it's been shrinking at a rate that most people, I don't think, are paying enough attention to. This chart that I've got over here from CryptoQuant shows that since November, 100,000 Bitcoin have been leaving the exchanges nearly every month. Think about that. It's huge. 600,000 less Bitcoin on the exchanges over the past 6.5 to 7 months. Nearly 100,000 a month has been leaving the exchanges. So this is where I think, again, if we go back to the Bitcoin market cap multiplier that we were just playing around with, we could very comfortably see a world where Bitcoin does get to that $7 million, price point. And again, this is not in hyperinflation dollars. This is in very realistic, today's value of Bitcoin. Okay, this isn't talking about a crazy, crazy world. This isn't talking about a world where a loaf of bread's $1,000, like many people think that Bitcoin is talking about. No. We're talking about today's purchasing power. And we're talking about the money that is in the world today. This is very important. Now, I want to take a little bit of a look over here at my favorite platform. So this here is When Moon. And this here is not only going to tell us how much Bitcoin you need to retire, but it's going to tell you the exact date of when you can retire. And it's going to tell you how much Bitcoin you have to spend each day to fund the lifestyle that you want. That's what I love about this. I'm going to try to make this calculator as big as possible so you guys can see all the numbers we're going to be cranking about. We need to run 4 different simulations that I think are really interesting because we can see that it's going to ask you how much Bitcoin you hold, what's your desired income in today's dollars, very important, today's dollars. Then it asks you how much do you think the money supply is going to expand, and it's also going to ask us how much do you think Bitcoin is going to appreciate into the future. So let's start breaking this down. I want to run a couple simulations. Let's start with the big boy number. Let's start with the whole coiners, 1 Bitcoin. Someone who has about $110,000 in Bitcoin today. Let's show you how quickly you can retire with this calculator. So let's say you want to be spending $100,000 a year, your desired income. Again, that's pretty good. Let's assume the money supply expands at 12%. But with this annual Bitcoin appreciation rate, I think this is way too bearish. I actually want to knock this up a little bit because, again, if I jump on over here and show you a quick little video about Bitcoin's CAGR, it's much, much, much higher than, you know, the 20 or the 30% that a lot of people think Bitcoin's going to be growing by and has been growing by. When we take a look here, this is one of my favorite videos. So it shows us Bitcoin's CAGR. For the first, 6 to 7 years of Bitcoin, you can see the CAGR was in the hundreds of percent per year. And if you actually look at Bitcoin from its inception to today, its CAGR is like 190%, which is pretty crazy, over 16 years. I think it's far too conservative to be using a CAGR like 20 and 30%, like what Michael Saylor is talking about. I think he talks about those numbers on the national news to stay super conservative. Like you can even see here in 2020, Bitcoin's 10-year CAGR was 200%. Its 8-year CAGR was like 80%. I think we need to be thinking bigger and getting a little bit more bullish about where Bitcoin's going to be. You can see here Bitcoin's 10-year CAGR 63%, and this was measured over a very bearish 10-year time frame for Bitcoin. So let's again run your own numbers, but I'm going to plug in a 50% CAGR. Let's assume Bitcoin appreciates at 50% per year. And now let's figure out when you can retire with 1 Bitcoin. You can see it's actually 2029. Your personal moon date is 2029. I think this is absolutely fascinating. I can't highlight the numbers for you, but you can see it here. It's the 20th of the 4th, 2029. So at that time, Bitcoin will be worth your 1 Bitcoin will be worth $754,000 if it continues to appreciate by the 50% per year. And if fiat continues to depreciate by 12% per year, which again is something that I think is incredibly conservative, that's something that this calculator takes into account. As you can see, it runs all of the numbers in the background here. It shows us the stack size over time. That's how much your savings is worth. Calculates Bitcoin's appreciation. It also calculates fiat's depreciation. So again, I really love this this little calculator because it shows everyone based upon how much Bitcoin you have, exactly when you can retire. Now, I want to run a couple more calculations here with 0.1 Bitcoin. That's 10% of a Bitcoin, because that number is it's very bullish, let's say that. But I want to show you a couple of more little things here. So it says here, because I get questions about this. People say, okay, I've played around with this calculator, Luke. It tells me that my 1 Bitcoin's enough to retire by 2029, but it tells me I have to sell $500 of Bitcoin every day. Okay, now let's show you what I mean by this. At the very bottom here, I'm going to try to highlight what I'm talking about. Your first daily draw will be 59,000 Satoshis. At the time, that will be worth $449. And hey, I don't mind living on a budget of $449 a day. I think that would go a long way. Don't you worry about that. But again, a lot of people say, well, should I be selling my Bitcoin when that day comes, when I do want to retire on my Bitcoin? Again, I always tell you guys, I don't think you should be retiring on your Bitcoin or selling your Bitcoin. I think there's much better solutions for you guys to take advantage of when you do come to some sort of a realization that you want to start using some of your Bitcoin to live on. Again, there's much smarter ways to not take the tax hit and actually live on your Bitcoin in a far more advantageous way. I think the best way to do this is with a peer-to-peer Bitcoin lending platform. Okay, again, I've been looking for a platform that actually is peer-to-peer and actually doesn't take custody of your Bitcoin for some time now. Obviously, since the blow-ups of BlockFi, Celsius, and FTX, we all learned that platforms that take custody of your Bitcoin and don't tell you where the yield is coming from, they should not be trusted. But obviously, I think a platform like FIREFISH can be trusted. Again, they're a partner of the show because they are a fully backed Bitcoin peer-to-peer lending platform. As you can see, they have all sorts of different rates and different deals on this platform. You can go on there and you can literally set the terms of the deal that you want, and you can be matched up with a buyer or a seller around the world. Again, I think this is a really interesting solution to actually using Bitcoin. Again, so many people I think wrongly have the idea that, hey, we never sell our Bitcoin. That is true. We never sell our Bitcoin, but we should be using Bitcoin eventually to upgrade our lifestyle. And I really like what FIREFISH has built. Again, they don't take custody of your Bitcoin. I highly recommend you check them out. You can get 30% off your first transaction with FIREFISH if you use a promo code Luke. So very, very simple, easy to remember. It is also linked down below in the description. So you can't go wrong. And you should never be taking the tax hit on your Bitcoin, especially when your Bitcoin could be worth so much in the future. Let's jump back on over to Moon and this calculator, because there's another simulation I want to run. Okay, so again, summarize. One Bitcoin could very comfortably be worth $754,000 by 2029, and you could be retired by 2029, living on $100,000 a year. Again, to get even more bullish, what happens if we think Bitcoin's appreciating by 80% per year? Let's have a look at how the numbers change. All of a sudden, you can retire in 2026. Okay, so again, compound interest. There's a reason why Albert Einstein called it the eighth wonder of the world. It's very difficult to understand exponential change. And this is why I really like this calculator. Kind of helps us grasp or visualize exponential change. Now let's move down to 0.1 Bitcoin. Let's start super conservative. Let's assume Bitcoin appreciates by 50% per year. That's what I've got here. And let's say we want to survive on $100,000 a year. I think you can retire in most places around the world on $100,000 a year, with that caveat being, hey, you're not living in Toronto or Sydney, Australia, or LA, or some of these megally overpriced mega cities that there is around the world. Again, there's tactics here to a Bitcoin retirement plan. All of a sudden, with just 0.1 Bitcoin, again, today that's an investment of about $11,000, you can retire by 2037. That's just in 12 years. And again, this is the very conservative look at Bitcoin retirement, because we're only assuming Bitcoin appreciates by 50% per year. Again, I think it's conservative. Let's just say that. I ran the numbers in another video showing just how conservative that is. I think we're going to be seeing a little bit higher CAGRs than that for a little bit longer than most people think, but let's just start conservative. So again, 0.1 Bitcoin, it's not bad. You can retire pretty soon. Now let's take a little bit of a peep. Let's also have a look at something that's a little bit more bullish. Let's take a peep at 80%. Let's assume Bitcoin's appreciating by 80%. And again, that small difference between Bitcoin appreciating at 50 and 80%, all of a sudden you can retire in 2031. So again, much sooner and much quicker than you might think. But again, this is why you've got to get into the market now. Again, it's always, time in the market beats time in the market. We all know that. And obviously, the longer you're outside of Bitcoin, more of these gains that you're going to be missing out on. Okay, again, what do they say in Bitcoin? Bitcoin's 12 best days every year literally outperform the rest of the year. This is something most people just are completely unaware of. That's right. Bitcoin's 12 best days are that powerful. Okay, they're incredibly powerful. This is why I tell you, be in the market today. Again, do not take the chance on these bureaucrats in the West coming after us, because that day is also coming, as I want to quickly have a little bit of a peep at here in a moment, because I think the plans all across the West, especially in Europe, they're getting a little bit scary and they're getting a little bit dangerous. I want to talk about what's changed over in the ECB, the European Central Bank, in a moment. But again, before I get there, just remind you guys, again, if you are looking for somewhere to buy your Bitcoin, I recommend the Bitcoin Well. Kind of like FIREFISH, they're a Bitcoin-only platform that doesn't take custody of your Bitcoin. This is why I love both of these companies. Again, I only tell you guys about products I use myself. I like both these guys because they don't take custody of your Bitcoin. So if you want to buy your Bitcoin, I recommend the Bitcoin Well. I think they're the best Bitcoin exchange out there. And you even get rewarded with Bitcoin for buying Bitcoin. So again, use the link in the description of today's show, promo code Green Candle. And if you want to actually back up your Bitcoin correctly, because again, if you buy Bitcoin from the Bitcoin Well, you're going to be forced to take self-custody. when you do, there's a couple of simple rules you should be following. Put it in a Bitcoin hardware wallet, preferably Bitcoin only. Doesn't necessarily matter that much. Just put it in a hardware wallet and then back up your Bitcoin. This is the important step. Make sure you don't write down your Bitcoin 12 or 24 words on paper. Paper's flimsy, paper breaks, paper does not survive a fire. The only thing that does is titanium. I think titanium's the solution. Okay, if you do have your Bitcoin written down on something like paper, I always encourage you guys, rip it up after you've written down your 12 or 24 words on titanium. Again, so check out Stampseed if you want to take advantage of their titanium plates. You can use a promo code Luke15 to get 15% off anything from Stampseed. Now let's get a little bit more bullish. Let's talk a little bit more about this Bitcoin retirement calculator that I think is very, very underserved in the Bitcoin space. Again, 2031, I love how this thing breaks down the numbers year by year. And it tells you how much Bitcoin you should be borrowing against each year.